Well, hello, this is Tony Crisp. Welcome to Sunshine and Transparency. Today, we're going to discuss freedom of speech. Uh, there's an awful lot here to discuss. And but we're gonna get started on it right away. It's we're taping this a day early on a Saturday, but there's nothing today that deserves a discussion more than freedom of speech. And we're going to use mainly for the discussion Jonathan Turley's book. Here's a copy of it right here. Okay. The Indispensable Right, which is freedom of speech. And he just published it a couple of weeks ago. I've gone through the whole book. I'm just totally impressed with it. And I just couldn't agree with somebody more. Uh, Professor Turley teaches in law school. He's a lawyer. He's been on TV many times, but I developed a whole new level of respect for him in reading this book. And as I said, I couldn't agree more. Now, what does freedom of speech mean? People say the First Amendment, freedom of speech. What does it mean? Well, the fact that it's a right, one of the bill, number one in the Bill of Rights, means that it actually trumps the law because it's a birthright. Very hard to change a birthright. Okay. Laws it depends on who the legislation is, and they can change them left and right. And we're a country of laws, but rights we're born with. And this is the first one. We're free to speak. Our show wouldn't exist if there wasn't freedom of speech. Our website, odysseyin.info, the 42 papers I've written on Odyssey Investments, one word, .info, are under opposed to the consensus, right? Do you think that would be allowed if we didn't have freedom of speech? Of course not. So the papers, including today's talk on freedom of speech, are all on the website, 42 papers, all on different subjects. If you should go to the website and under opposed to the consensus, you depress opposed to the consensus, you can access them. Many of them are only 2 or 3 pages long. There are a couple that are significantly longer. So, what does the First Amendment say? How many people know? Let me read it to you. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition government for a redress of grievances. Now, those are rights. We're all allowed to do them. And so if you want to list them, it goes way beyond freedom of speech. Of course, there's freedom of speech, the public expression of opinion without government censorship, interference, or restraint. There's freedom of the press. There's freedom of religion, the freedom to practice religion freely. There's freedom of assembly, the right of people to gather together and protest. And there's freedom to petition the government, the right to petition the government to address specific grievances. All those rights are in our very first amendment in our Bill of Rights. That's cool. Now, the foundation of our Bill of Rights outline the Declaration of Independence as well as the Constitution's Bill of Rights rest on our freedom of speech. To me, it's the most elemental right. And of course, Mr. Turley calls it the indispensable right, and it is. So are we free to say anything? I'm going to kill you? No, we're not free. We're not free to say things that harm or destroy people and property. We are not free. We're not free to threaten death or bodily injury to any human being. So it's not completely, we're not free to scream fire in a crammed movie theater. We're not allowed to put human lives unnecessarily at risk. Oh, incidentally, thank you, Oliver Wendell Holmes, for the fire in the movie theater, which he was one of our Supremes years ago. What about rage? Are we allowed to show rage? Yes. Rage is one man's passion, and rage can be passion to a believer. So what is rage to one man is passion to a believer. So in Jonathan Turley's book, The Indisputable Right, we're living in an age of rage, Mr. Turley says. It permeates every aspect of our society and politics. Rage is liberating, even addictive. Now, can you imagine rage being addictive? I mean, if it could stimulate adrenal and dopamine, it could theoretically be addictive. It allows us to say and do things that we would ordinarily avoid, even denounce in others. For those who agree with the underlying message, it is righteous and passionate. For those who disagree, it is dangerous and destabilizing, Mr. Turley says in his introduction. And he goes on to say, the government killed Antigone and Socrates due to their free speech. Socrates drank the hemlock. Turley goes on to cover Spinoza's natural rights theory and comments about it, saying, quote, the dangers of free speech from a perspective of government would only increase after the invention of the printing press. Think about it. That opened up a whole nother dimension, the printing press. Turley, in his fascinating book, looks at our period of speech suppression to try to get an understanding of what is occurring today. He shows there is no clear distinction between rage and rebellion. Now it gets scary. When rage turns into rebellion, then it becomes at the very least, if not treasonable, it becomes seditious. Sedition is a word government uses to repress freedom of speech that they determine is bent on destroying them, government. So basically, he goes on, and to keep in mind that today we're in a period, as Turley says, a period of rage, and you see the polarity in our system today. You see the number of Americans who just hate Trump. They just, oh my God, they just hate Trump. I mean, you even have political leaders who had positions, including Biden, years ago, that supported a border wall, minimizing immigration, but because it was Trump's policy, doing the actual opposite and opening the border. I mean, the hatred of Trump. I don't think I've ever seen anything that rivals it in my life in America. And conversely, on the other side, there's a hatred of the deep state, the government, and the growth in the government today is almost off the charts. And the funding, the monies that have flown, that have been spent since 2017 by both parties, just unparalleled in our history. And actually, I should throw Obama into that too. $9 trillion he spent is not chump change. Of course, he did it in 8 years. And these guys are trying to do it in 4 each apiece. So, but let's Turley in his history of freedom of speech takes us back to other difficult times in America. And I think that's very important and very informative because you begin to think that have we ever had anything like this before? And yes, we have. And I want to cover some of those additional times that Turley mentions. And prior to that, I'll say Madison was a champion of freedom of speech, and Adams was basically opposed to freedom of speech. So you had Madison and Jefferson on one side, and possibly, arguably, uh, Adams was on the opposite side. And you've had a couple, before we go on, you've had a couple of interesting things that were just disclosed in the press a couple of days ago. You had a letter by Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg to the US Congress, and the letter said that Zuckerberg was expressing extreme frustration and anger about the Biden-Harris administration's pressure to block and demote content regarding the coronavirus. And on Monday, in his letter, he went further, and he said there were efforts to repress, successful efforts to repress Hunter Biden's laptop, the information. And for some reason, Zuckerberg is coming clean in admitting these very repressive actions, and that was right in the middle of an election. Okay, I mean, but to have Zuckerberg admit it raises some interesting questions. Why would he come clean now? Does he think Trump's going to win, or has he maybe rethought supporting Kamala Harris? The fact that she's favored the Palestinians so heavily and acted with Biden to not send armaments to Israel. I mean, it's very interesting that he should choose to come clean, and it's not as precisely clean as we'd like, because we would like to see what he did erase. What did you erase off Facebook, Mr. Zuckerberg? Can you put the specifics out? We'd all like to know. And what specifically did you do to conceal and misrepresent the Hunter Biden laptop? We'd like to know all the specifics, but we're glad to hear that you actually came clean. So government uses its position sometimes to inject false narratives to influence the public. And it's a clear violation of freedom of the press. It's a clearest violation you come up, which is guaranteed under our First Amendment. So Jonathan Turley, there's a number of historic examples that made me feel a lot better over the rage that he so brilliantly defines today in the system. So he goes. So I want to give you a few of his examples. He comments, before 1700, there were 1,244 recorded sedition trials. Now, what does sedition means? Conduct or speech inciting people to rebel against authority. Authority is usually the government, right? So if you incite people to rebel against the government, you can get charged with sedition. Well, there were 1,244 sedition trials in colonial courts, Mr. Turley says. 1,244. Boy, that's a lot more than we had, 20? I don't know how many. We'll get to that later in the January 6th hearings. Not that many. And he goes on, and he talks about 1786. Farmers who fought during the Revolution weren't being paid their war salaries and were under threat of losing their farms for lack of funds. Daniel Shea was a decorated soldier during the war and led Shea's rebellion on August 29, 1786, after the Civil War. There was a riot in Northampton, Mass. On September 19th, 1786. The Massachusetts Supreme Court indicted 11 people as disorderly, riotous, and seditious persons. Shays' Rebellion was chilling in that it occurred just 10 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed. So even though the Declaration had been signed, even though we'd been granted a Bill of Rights, years later, this officer who fought in the Revolutionary War felt so incensed by what was going on that he actually had a rebellion. Following that, in 1791, there was, Mr. Turley tells us, there was a whiskey rebellion, which followed the same pattern of economic grievances: worthless money, unpaid war debts, farm seizures. Much of the country were farmers because they had to eat. There wasn't the centralization of work that we have today, post-industrial revolution. So losing a farm meant you lost your livelihood. And government crackdowns. An excise tax by Hamilton. Hamilton, a little bit like Adams, was not a big fan of freedom of speech. So in the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania, locals attacked those who were viewed as assisting the federal government. Hamilton wanted the riots crushed, but Jefferson sided with the dissidents. In the end, it was all the rage on both sides. After that, Turley talks about, and that was two separate incidents within 15, 16 years of signing the Declaration of Independence. So it wasn't a very, it was a fairly tumultuous couple of decades. The next rebellion, which occurred in 1798, okay, so make it three, 86 to 98, three rebellions, was Fry's Rebellion, which occurred before Christmas, 1798. Arguably the most illustrative, Mr. Turley says, because it relates to recent times. The protest was triggered by the signing of two pieces of legislation by Adams, July 14, 1798, the Sedition Act and the Tax Act. When the tax collectors appeared, the farmers of Pennsylvania rose. The leader, John Fry's, was also a veteran of the Revolutionary War, where he commanded a company. Fry stood with 140 men. Half were armed, wanted the protest to remain peaceful. He said, Fry told his men, please, for God's sake, don't fire except if we're fired upon. First, on March 12th, Adams ordered the group to disperse. The same Adams that thought the Boston Tea Party was essentially for freedom. Of course, you can see when a person goes into a position of power, they become a little hypocritical about free speech, right? Of the 211 who were arrested, 40% were soldiers that had fought in the Revolutionary War. So basically you had the Boston Tea Party. You had after the signing of all of our sacred documents, the Constitution, the Declaration, the Bill of Rights, you had Shays' Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, and Fry's Rebellion in essentially 2 decades. And there were sedition charges. People were arrested. In Fry's Rebellion, it wasn't violent, but there were still charges. So the debate would continue of how to punish seditious acts between Madison and Jefferson. So right now, it didn't end there. In 1833, President Andrew Jackson unilaterally suspended both civil authority and civil liberties in what has been described as, and these are Turley is quoting, lunatic militarism. Jackson established, and I quote, a police state with no other authority but his own. Wow. We haven't gone down to that yet. Okay. After the Battle of New Orleans, Jackson refused to lift martial law. He kept martial law in place even after the battle, even after engaging the British on January 8, 1905. He finally lifted martial law on March 13th. Then you go forward, you get to the Civil War. During the Civil War, Vallandigham, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, a congressman acting with his free speech rights, denounced the war in 1863 and was sentenced to be incarcerated for the duration of the war. Lincoln commuted his sentence, but condemned him to banishment to the South. He had to cross the border into the South as banishment. Lincoln also suspended habeas corpus, for God's sakes, in banning the congressman, amplified the anti-free speech purpose of the prosecution. Lincoln reverted to the Sedition Act in his treatment of what became known as the Copperheads Rebellion. Now, these were people in political positions. This man was a U.S. congressman who was arrested for sedition. Of course, it was in the middle of a civil war. People were dying. It was a very unpleasant situation all around. In 1886, the Haymarket riot is a vivid example of rage rhetoric triggering state rage. 8 were convicted in the Haymarket riot. This is right after the Civil War. 7 were sentenced to death for violating sedition, but only 4 were hung. The speeches called for strikes by the Working Man's Party in the Haymarket Square in Chicago the night before the riots. Extremists again triggered extreme reaction from the state. After that, okay, here you had 4 people hung. Wow, that's almost on a level of treason. That goes beyond sedition, you would think. Then you had the Sedition Act, formally legislated in 1918. After the Espionage Act, which is treason, was passed in 1917 to cover a wider range of offenses. It made it illegal to, quote, willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, unscrupulous, or abusive language about the form of the government of the United States. Now, this is much stricter than what had existed before. And it wasn't enforced. It was very, very rarely enforced. It also empowered the Postmaster General to seize mail that it judged to fall within these categories. So the new Sedition Act led to the imprisonment of almost 1,000 people. And more sedition occurred during World War II, when Roosevelt wanted anti-war talk to stop. Pelly, a candidate for president in 1936, was arrested and convicted on 11 charges. In 1942, Roosevelt had persuaded Biddle, the Attorney General, and J. Edgar Hoover to sweep away dissenters. These leaders followed a pattern similar to Adams. That wasn't a very good thing for freedom of speech. Okay, again, the setting was a war, and there's an awful lot of we're not our country is not in a war presently, although there are wars going on, and we're very very polarized over positions we have over those wars. Seditious crackdowns would continue in periods of temporary panic. Under the Securities Act of 1950, now you get to Joe McCarthy. Wow. And President Harry Truman. And McCarthy's lawyer, Cohen, came up with a list of 250 commies, 250 communists. They ruined a lot of people's lives in that extreme period of McCarthyism. And really, Truman didn't stand up and say anything till 6 years later, till 1956, where he finally said, horrible cancer is eating at the vitals of America. Finally, Bertram Russell was charged, but he didn't get a consequence. He ended up with a Nobel Prize in literature. Bertram Russell didn't get the hemlock. Nonetheless, McCarthy's blacklist, as I did say, would hurt very severely many Americans. Then we come up to present on January 6th. There were clear, and this is what Professor Turley says, and I can't agree more. There were clear crimes that were legitimately prosecuted for trespass and assault. Only a dozen of the hundreds of cases persecuted included seditious conspiracy. Now, those were all in essentially two groups, and they were Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, two very extreme fringe groups that were represented on January 6th. And I don't think they amounted to 5% of the people that were there. But the other thing Professor Turley mentions, which is very informative, is that the sentences they were given by the Second Circuit suggested treason, not sedition. And their attorneys were arguing that to the Second Circuit. They were given sentences that in Professor Turley's opinion were beyond what is called for sedition and is elevated to the level of treason, which they never were convicted or charged of treason. And that's sad. And we heard some of their sentences going up to 20 years in prison. I mean, there are people that commit murder that don't serve 20 years. And so you have this whole mosaic through time of all these periods of rage where there's polarity in our society and where otherwise good people stand on opposite ends of an issue. And we're seeing it today. And it's such a timely book that Mr. Turley has written. But the issue is the story, not the book. And it's the issue of free speech. And the fact that in America, we're pretty much blessed that we're able to speak. I mean, my show and the papers I write are not mainstream papers, and but our object is to get to the truth, and the truth will set you free, right? And Turley at one point gives a beautiful quote by John Stuart Mills, philosopher, economist, statesman, all three and more. Such a powerful, developed utilitarian philosophy, and such a powerful voice. And rather than go back to the ancients, Plato and Aristotle, I think it's appropriate to read what he said and then spend a minute talking about it, and then we'll bring this to an end. We hope to. I might mention this. We're hoping to get George Washington, James Renwick Manship III. He's a George Washington actor, to join me on the podcast soon. And if we're lucky, we may even be doing one during the week with him. But if we had the way to set it up, I'd love to have had him right now on with me. But let's go. What did John Stuart Mill say about how important is freedom of speech? How important is it for us to be able to show rage, not rage that destroys humans or destroys property, but rage in our opinions? Mr. Mills says the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity, as well as the existing generation, not only today, throughout all time. Those who dissent from the opinion still more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they're deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. Think of it. If the opinion and the rage is correct, you can actually go, huh, he's right, and change your mind. Now, if it's repressed and you never hear it, you go on thinking the same ignorant thing you thought, which is incorrect. If wrong, they lose. What is almost as great a benefit, the clear perception and livelier impression of truth produced by the collision with an error. Okay, so the rage is wrong. Okay, you go, I know I'm right because it collided with the truth. And he says that's as important. So there's nothing wrong with showing rage or passion. Passion's another way to say it in an argument. There's nothing wrong with dissenting. It's just when it gets to the point where you touch the person, when you touch their nose, their arm, or their hand, you could easily be committing a violation. And when you threaten life, either harming or destroying it and property, you're going sideways with the law. But that said, how many countries allow dissidents to show rage against issues publicly? Not many. Not many. I mean, we've had our periods in time where our leaders have come down with sedition charges and on them, even in that context. Now, the minute it digresses into violence, of course, that's illegal. It's wrong. It involves the law. That's not freedom of speech. But the allowance to the allowing citizens to show rage and show dissent is quite a good way to address grievances. It lets off the steam, if no other reason. And to repress it is not right. I mean, if you were in cheese China, my God, I would be, I wouldn't have a show. I wouldn't have my show, Sunshine. And my show's name, incidentally, is Sunshine and Transparency. It would not exist in cheese China. It would not exist in Putin's Russia. It would not exist in the Ayatollah's Iran. It would not exist in North Korea. Okay. And the list goes on. I mean, there are things we're seeing around the world where freedom of speech is being repressed. And again, such a timely book. Professor Torelli did a great job. I hope we shine some light on the current rage that all of us see. I hope we put it in context with Professor Turley's help by outlining the times in the past when rage took front stage and what happened. And I hope you all have a blessed week. We'll look for you next week. Hopefully we may have James Manship III, George Washington with us. We may stay with this topic. I am working on the side on a tax code. I may not be finished with that next week, but remember one thing: we're just finishing a period in American history, and it's hard for me to put the starting date on it. I want to almost say 2009 through 2024, but I can definitely say 2018. I can excuse Trump's first year, 2017, because he said, I'm never going to do this again after he posted the deficit in 2017. Then he turned around and did it. I can excuse possibly Trump's first COVID spending package, not his second one, certainly not Biden's, where Larry Summers stood up and told Kamala Harris, passing this package will be inflationary in 2021. Duh, you think so? Huh, sure it was. And she cast a deciding vote, or the chips, or anything that was done in the spending smorgasbord during the Biden years, all the way up to the joke of an Inflation Reduction Act, if you will, for another 1.8 trillion that's ongoing. So there's going to be consequences to this period. I also greatly fault Benedict Bernanke for setting the stage and putting a philosophy in place and keeping interest rates artificially low, tempting the Congress to spend. Well, why not? It's only 2%, guys, to run up the debt. 9 trillion with Obama, 7.8 trillion with Trump. And guess what? Trump's was in 4 years, and Obama was 8. And Biden now in his 4th year looks to break Trump's record. Can you believe it? And it's going to dry up after the election. There's going to be consequences, but I hope we understand the cause so we don't blame each other. We have to understand the cause. And the cause is the government is out of control. And it's not only that the tax code needs to be redone, it certainly does. But even more importantly, we have to do something that's never been done. We have to reduce the size of government. You think? You think we can do that if we want to stay as a nation? If we want the currency not to tank more than it has in the last 3 years? That's our choice. So at Sunshine and Transparency, we're going to be there, and we're going to try to keep America focused on what the true primary causes of these problems that are coming in 2025 are. Because they're deferred, as is often the case in economics, you do an activity, but you don't get the cause for many months, many times as much as 25, 20, 26 months. But when the consequence comes, people need to be reminded what the cause was so we can address the problem and we don't end up getting mad at each other, causing all kinds of strife and more severe problems. So that's why we're here. We're going to be here then. We're going to be here on the day when the problems come up, the bigger problems come up from these actions that we've spoken of that may have started occurring as early as Ben Bernanke in 2006, and definitely with Obama in 2009, and ran on steroids through Trump and Biden in spending. And there are consequences. Now, you all have a blessed week. Welcome to Sunshine and Transparency. We look forward to seeing you next week. And hopefully we're going to have George Washington, James Renwick Manship III, he's an actor, good friend of mine, on the show. So be sure to stay tuned and have a blessed week. And bye-bye.